Good morning, everybody. I'm Liz with New Leaf Brokerage and here with my husband and colleague, James. We focus on exit planning and business brokerage, so helping small business owners sell their business. We talk on a daily basis with multiple buyers. We know that you all have a lot of questions, so we want to be here as a resource. So we put together just a quick tips for how to buy a business and looking through different scenarios that hopefully will be helpful to you guys. So with that, I'm going to let James go through.
Appreciate it, Liz. As Liz indicated, this is a high level, a little bit more of a new format in terms of we're discussing some different Q&A questions, but definitely from a high level. So it's a basic view. We're definitely here for additional questions, and we're happy to delve into very specific and detailed questions. With that being said, this is focused on just how to buy a business Q&A. We're going to start with the end in mind, and the reason we want to do that is you can essentially build out a business plan and an exit strategy before you even acquire a business. A lot of folks don't think of it that way. However, the most seasoned investors, that's their first question. What's your exit strategy? And I want to reiterate that very, very often because essentially the concepts of an exit plan increase the value and of your existing business. And so it is business strategy. So I want people to really come away with that in mind and understand that we're systematically looking at improving a business's value upon acquisition. So with that being said, we're going to go to the next slide here and dive right in. So our agenda for today is just kind of business buying 101. Again, exit strategy is business strategy. A wonderful quote here at the bottom right here from someone you may know. When you start a business, you should start with the end in mind. Warren Buffett, seasoned investor, very well respected, and I cannot agree more. We're going to discuss a timeline. What's a typical timeline of your acquisition and who are the parties involved? There's quite a few folks that can be on your team, and others prefer to go a more solo route with a support team. We're going to do a live business review. So we're going to go over a real business listing confidentially, and we're going to kind of do, we're going to go over a few topics, what to look for, what do I see. The good news is everyone sees something different. So that's kind of the value of having a different and well-versed and complementary advisory team. So with that being said, we're going to start with the 8 key drivers of business value. These key drivers have a lot of different terms. So, if you're working with a current business coach or someone else on your advisory team, they may use a different term, but essentially all business value is derived from 8 key drivers. They might condense or expand from that. However, the important thing to take away from this is that you really want to look at the business value from the buyer lens. So, it's the same concept from the seller side as the buyer side. How do we drive value of a business and how do we increase value? It's exactly the same concept, aka exit strategy equals business strategy. So with that being said, we'll kind of go through real quickly here. We're happy to go into more detail on each of them, but financial performance, how strong are the numbers? Most folks focus on that straight out of the gate because if the numbers don't work from the buyer side and the numbers don't work on the seller side, then it doesn't really constitute a fair market value acquisition. So most folks don't proceed beyond that point. So that's a very important one. However, the others are important as well. Growth potential, how's the industry look? Is it stagnant? Is it declining? Is it have opportunity for growth potential? And how does that impact the business? How are they structured for that growth? Number 3, Switzerland structure, a fun one in terms of the term. Switzerland means neutral, going back to, World War I and II, etc. Switzerland is the concept of how reliant a business is on a single employee or a single supplier, etc. So essentially, we want to focus on going through and understanding, is it a single person operator and is that going to create an issue for folks there? And the valuation teeter-totter. So the valuation teeter-totter is, how's your cash flow? Is there a lot of cash coming in, a lot of cash coming out? And how does that look in terms of cash flow, working capital, et cetera? Recurring revenue, that's another concept that a lot of folks really focus on, and it is extremely helpful in terms of looking at the different types. There's six different. A lot of folks don't focus on that. However, there's a lot of ways to look at that. Monopoly control, how much market share do they have? A few years ago, there was a lot of search engines. I remember Ask Jeeves, for example. Now it's mostly, Google or Bing, etc. Another one was that fun CD, the AOL Online, for the dial-up service. Now there's, quite a few service providers. So what is your market share? How are you differentiated from other businesses? Customer satisfaction. A lot of folks know how their customers respond, and generally it's a good thing. However, the other thing to keep in mind is that essentially there's often not a process in place. Are they looking at an NPS, a net promoter score, and actually documenting how their customers respond? A lot of people point to Google reviews, which makes a lot of sense. However, you're not really capturing the downside. So having a bit of a process, which isn't very hard to implement, can really be helpful. And finally, the hub and spoke, another great one that's heavily focused on in terms of think of a spider web or a hub and spoke, and how is their structure in place and process procedure. The greatest test for that is if the business owner goes away for vacation for a month, is the business operating smoothly or relatively smoothly versus it having some trouble operating because it's too focused on going back to the Switzerland structure, perhaps with an owner operator, from that perspective. So with that being said, those are kind of 8 key drivers of business value, and probably how I would look at it if you're looking to acquire. Welcome some attendees here, Terry and Marlon. Thanks for coming. We're kind of in the middle here, but we'll get to a stopping point here soon. So happy to field any questions at that point. With that being said, we're at the acquisition timer slide. I think a lot of folks are going to look at this a little bit differently, but we tried to just break it down into phases. In my opinion, it's a lot easier to eat very, very small pieces at once. What I encourage folks to think about here are, do you have a reasonable timeline, and is your team capable to hit that timeline? So, going through the phases here, we broke it into 8 phases. Essentially, phase 1, establish your buy box. What are you interested in? What industry, geographics, etc.? Formulate your advisory team. Phase 2, do you have a team that's capable? Maybe you're working with a family member and perhaps a CPA, attorney, etc. Acquire funding partners. The goal there is to establish your upper echelon or limit there. So what do I mean by that? If you're trying to buy a $1 million business and you're only approved for 500K and you don't have an outside cash influx or partner, then you're going to have issues with getting approval there. And conversely, maybe you're looking at a 500K acquisition, but you have $1 million approval. Maybe you want to acquire 2 businesses. So there's a lot of ways to look at that and kind of formulate a plan there. Again, thinking about the exit in mind, or the end in mind first. What's your exit plan prior to acquiring your business, and how it relates to your acquisition plan and your acquisition timer. And then finally, phase 4, inquire and analyze buyer listings. That's going through. We're going to do that in a little bit here, but essentially go over some listings. Think about a few things specifically, connect with brokers, connect with other business owners maybe in your network that are thinking about selling, etc. And, put together your own valuation and, go to phase 5, submit an LOI, start negotiation. Once you execute that LOI, we typically see, 45 to 90 days from LOI execution to close, which includes the due diligence process, phase 6, and the drafting of the purchase agreement. And then finally, moving towards close and transition. That time frame can vary quite a bit. And overall, your acquisition timer can vary a lot. So, oftentimes folks spend several years, putting together a plan or finding the right business, and others find it in a month or 2. And, they're closing in under 6 months with that full plan in mind. So it just really depends how aggressive you want to be. And, sometimes it's just pure luck. You found the right business and it worked out great for you. But the biggest thing is, I want to focus on the bottom there, the perks of planning. 82% of buyers, 4 out of 5 folks that have an acquisition plan spend less achieve a higher ROI, meaning their investment tends to pay off much quicker, and you just have a smoother transition with the existing seller. So, that's one of the big things that I want to convey there. So we'll kind of move on to the next slide here. I'm going to take a quick break here and field any questions with some of our newcomers here. A good checkpoint here, we're going to actually go over a listing here, two listings. So with that being said, I know, Terry and Marlon there, you've had, you just popped in, but if you have any specific questions, we can dive right in on that and then kind of go from there.
And if you don't, that's okay too. If you want to pop anything in the chat, feel free to. But James will kind of dive into this and then we can go into any questions.
Wonderful. So we're going to dive right in then. And so with that being said, this is a real business listing that I pulled off basically the internet, and it's not related necessarily to any listing that we're representing. So just completely agnostic. I purposely did that just to kind of look at it through a buyer lens. So, if you're looking at this and wondering why things were done a certain way, don't point the finger at me. I just kind of pulled the info. I think it tells a story though. And so that's what I want to go over here is what stands out about this opportunity for you, just working left to right, up to top to down. The first thing I noticed is the asking price here at 4 million to 7 million. That's a really interesting and telling range. Normally when a seller, put yourself in the seller's shoes here, they are going over a range of value from their perspective. So where do we expect this business to sell? That's an extremely wide range, as you can tell. A $3 million variance, 7 million is a lot different than 4 million, right? So I think what that tells me is that they don't have a strong idea of what their business is really worth, which to me means that from a buyer perspective, you can take charge of this situation a little bit more and put together a strong case for what you think it might be worth. Maybe it is worth 6.5, 7 million, but if you truly think it's worth 4 to 5, then I think you can go in with that in mind and provide some supporting valuation from that perspective and try to work out a deal there. So with that being said, we're going to move over to revenue. When you look at the revenue structure in the column, the left column there in the bottom, it's a steady growth. That's a great story there. They only had a little setback from 22 to 23. So to me, that tells me this is a very stable residential landscaping company, and probably has consistent sales, and they seem to be not impacted much by COVID too, which is very interesting. So I think that was another thing that was telling here. Their earnings at $1.2 million currently. I think the biggest thing, if you look at the earnings, or some people might say benefit to owner, or SDE, or EBITDA, I think clarification on that's going to be very key here, because it's just a lump sum number there. The biggest thing I want to point out is that progression of 21 to 22. It goes from 663K up to over 1 million. Great progression there, and it follows the revenue. So what that tells me is they're not only increasing top line revenue, they're increasing their profit efficiency, but they had a pretty big dip there in 23. So they regressed a little bit on the revenue, not much, less than 5% there, but their earnings took a very large dip. So we want to definitely understand what's going on there. They bounced back pretty quickly. Maybe they were writing off a lot of personal expenses, and things were definitely adjusted there. But the key here is understanding the story there, which can obviously drive your LOI and really relates to that asking price. That range is pretty insane to me. So I think that not necessarily means a bad business, but it kind of tells me the seller doesn't really know. And it also tells me they're open. They're open to that $4 million amount. Otherwise, they wouldn't have put it up there, right? So I think that's pretty interesting. We're going to do one more slide on this residential landscaping, and then I'm going to take a quick pause there. This is more of the qualitative side. So this is the quantitative, and when we're looking at valuation side, numbers focused. Well, let's look back. Let's go into a little bit of those 8 key drivers. What can we glean from the listing? My advice here is try to get as much information on the front end, because if it's not a good fit for you, you're kind of wasting your own time, and you're wasting the broker's time and the seller's time, and you just doing a shotgun blast approach is probably not going to work. Having that acquisition plan, acquisition timer, have a focused and very driven approach to it. And if you do that, you can always widen it later. But start with a very manageable key industries and kind of go from there. And I think you'll find that the results are a little bit more defined and you'll be happier with that result. So with that being said, we're going to go to the next slide here. Same listing. This is written / redacted by somebody else, as I stated. The things that are really that stand out to me that are great for sure is that the owner started the company in 1977. He was 18, now ready to retire. So this is what I'd call a legacy business. Those are very, very desirable. Probably been with the company a long time, probably wearing a lot of hats. And this is probably their baby, so this is one where numbers only and sale price only isn't necessarily going to drive the result you're going to want from a buyer's perspective. Understanding what's important to the seller could really produce a much better result. For example, they may not want to sell to a PE fund, a large company, and they're willing to work more with an individual that is essentially more focused on carrying on that legacy. So, presenting the offer in that manner is naturally going to make sense. And so I think that's very interesting. They work in a high-end, they work on high-end houses, as it's notated here, and they're primary affluent homeowners, meaning their margins are probably quite healthy, as notated by the earnings and the prior slide. So I think that's another positive. The downside there is if there's issues with the economy, will that affect that area? I would do some research locally. Maybe they're affluent to the point where it won't matter, depending on the economy in that regard. So understanding the outside issues there could be very important. It looks like they have a 20% recurring revenue and 80% from construction projects, which tells me that they don't have a strong recurring revenue model. They're not over 50%, but they have it there. That's a good solid base. It probably helps cover overhead. And then they really go for those construction projects with higher margins, which is fairly typical if you see that 20-80 split or 80-20 split, depending on how you look at it. And there you go, looking for it. The owner is searching for a buyer that will continue the legacy they've built and will take care of the current employees. There it is. I didn't even get to that point and essentially brought it up without looking. The owner, the seller, is very, very focused based on this for someone carrying on that legacy and cares about the employees. So getting in there and cutting pay or benefits or just, hiring and firing people quickly is not the move for this business based on what I see. It's going in there with a soft touch. Hey, I care about these employees. I'm going to carry on the legacy and kind of go from there and kind of go in and really focus on providing the value to the seller. Why should you be the person they sell it to? There's going to be other offers probably at some point. So, try to showcase what your strengths are in that regard and match with theirs. Facts down at the bottom. 34 employees, so that's a solid amount of employees located in California. So again, going back to your buy box, if you're not looking at California, then probably not going to work for you unless you're willing to go out there or have a very strong GM in place to manage it from afar. The 34 employees tells me that they have a good hub and spoke, most likely, but you really want to understand the day-to-day on this seller. If they're wearing many hats, then be very, very confident that you can replace those skill sets or can hire to replace those skill sets, which can impact your valuation. Going back to that 4 to 7 million, very large range. So with that being said, I'm going to take a quick pause. If anyone has any questions, happy to delve into it on this listing or any of the prior slides. But if not, happy to move on to the second one and field any questions at the end.
Keep moving on then.
All right. Excuse me. Second one is an automotive repair shop. So this one's a little bit smaller than the prior one. Maybe the other business was a little bit too big for you, especially if it's your first acquisition. I totally get that. There's going to be a lot of different things you're going to want to consider. The advantages of a smaller business is that it can still have a decent foundation. You can build upon it and kind of grow it and pay a lot less for it, but there is inherently more risk with a with a younger company, for example, or a lower revenue company because there's less people involved. Going back to that hub and spoke, one of the 8 key drivers of that with regard to the business value and what have you. For this one, we're going to dive right in here. Asking price NA. You're going to see this once in a while, especially with larger acquisitions. So it's interesting with a smaller one here where they didn't provide a range nor an asking price. So again, what does that tell me? I don't know. It could mean quite a few things. One, they're not sure and they're just going to see what happens. Number two, it could be that they're really trying to focus on bringing in offers, generally speaking, and they're not necessarily looking at a range of value. It could mean that they haven't even analyzed it yet, which means they're disorganized. So maybe understand, why they didn't have an asking price. It's pretty rare that you have an NA asking price for a pretty standard industry, automotive repair shop, under, $5 million. So it's a lot more normal from a 5 million, 10 million, 20 million, where the valuations are quite high. So I think it's a little bit odd. So that I would really understand why do they have that, and talk to the broker about it or the seller. The revenue, 2 million, solid. So a good solid business, and as you can see, if we go down to the revenue here in a minute, earnings 300K. So, there's some wiggle room. If you're looking for a hybrid role, semi-absentee, the biggest thing that I would always recommend is when you look at those earnings and you're not sure if you can basically manage the business in replace of the seller and you don't have the skill set, you're going to have to hire. So take that 300K, and if you got to hire 100K GM, then it's really 200K in take home pay for you, less your debt service. So if you're using some debt to acquire the business, then it doesn't leave a whole lot left for you and your family. So that's the disadvantage of going a little bit smaller. If you are going smaller, I highly recommend focusing on industries you have experience in and know that you can fill those roles, and or lean on maybe some colleagues that do have experience there. So with that being said, we're going to go into the financial revenue. We have a little bit of a declining revenue here. So maybe that's going back to the asking price. They didn't want to put themselves into a box, so to speak, on the range of value there. They 2.7 grew a little bit in 23 and then dropped down by quite a bit there. That's a pretty heavy decline. The earnings followed a similar path. What does that tell me? This seller might have taken his foot off the gas. He or she is not, maybe they're getting close to retirement, or perhaps they are a little burnt out, or they lost a key employee, or they stopped marketing their business. So understanding the narrative and the story behind it is very important. So with that being said, we're going to go into the second slide here with the qualitative look. Headline: automotive repair shop specializing in European automobiles. So they specialize. So to me, that means that if there's a decline, then and it's not related to, I guess, drive, then is that related to the market? I doubt it. There's a lot of European automobiles on the road. If they provide excellent customer service, there really shouldn't be an issue there. I would probably want to understand more on their Google reviews and their NPS that I mentioned before, their Net Promoter Score. How are their customers responding? Maybe that's driving the decline, and kind of understanding their clients, their customers are large individual vehicle owners, but also do occasional commercial fleet work. So that's an interesting comment there. So it sounds like they have some recurring revenue. Understanding that could help mitigate risk on the acquisition side. Revenues transactional. Okay, I think that tells you that it kind of refutes the prior one a little bit. So I'd want to understand more on what they mean by that specifically. The owner is open to selling the business and retiring. So to me, this goes back to what I had thought prior. I think they probably are comfortable and they took their foot off the gas a little bit, and they're just seeing if they can get some offers in. If the right offer comes across the table, they might take it. It also tells me they may not be that serious about this. So again, understanding what's important to them, making sure that you're aligned and you're not wasting your time with them. So, I think being respectful, but also understanding, what's driving their decision, and developing a good rapport with them before, moving into that LOI phase might make a lot of sense here. The business established in 1988, a legacy business in a city downtown area. Oh, there we go. Business lost some employees, but it was trending back to 2025 closer to 2.2. Still not much of an increase there. That's only 10% up when they had lost, roughly 25 to 30% of their revenue. So a little bit of an uptick. The owner owns the building, is open to discussions around selling the building with the business or lease the space out. So there's an opportunity there if part of your acquisition plan is to include real estate. So a lot of times folks do want that and heavily do not. So they have a specific plan in place and they're going to want to acquire real estate. Generally, that's an appreciable asset over time. However, depending on your acquisition plan and what you discuss with your advisory team, that can vary quite a bit. So my advice there is to have a favorable lease if you're not going to acquire the real estate. In this case, 8 employees, not a ton. That's a pretty decent spread in terms of revenue to employee ratio. So that tells me the owner or seller is probably pretty heavily involved to some degree. Understanding those roles. Are they working on the vehicles themselves? Hiring a mechanic is another thing that would definitely be a very important question to ask. And then going back to the buy box, Milwaukee Metro and Wisconsin. So, if you're not looking for that area, geographically, or don't have someone anchored there, this would be certainly a more risky acquisition. So with that being said, happy to answer any questions with regard to this specific listing. And, maybe you see something different to me, and there's always different perspectives, but the key is to try to analyze some of that information on the front end to move as quickly towards that acquisition that fits best for you, your family and your acquisition timer and acquisition plan.
Yeah, the biggest thing I see in this is the specialization of the mechanics with the European automobiles. I think we've run into a few listings where we've had that, where that's obviously extremely specialized. And kind of to go back to the listing price, I think you're right in terms of the fact that they're just kind of putting it out there to see what they can get. But I also think that we've seen, when we're representing different sellers and we provide our valuation, sometimes there is that gap in terms of what we're valuing the business as and what a seller, especially someone who started the business and has that strong emotional tie to it, is. So sometimes we just take it out to the market to get the market feedback, and that answers the question itself.
Absolutely. That's a fair point and fairly common as well. Maybe they're approaching it from that perspective. And it definitely goes back to, the specialization portion that you're commenting on. If the owner is physically working on those automobiles in the specialized market, then that 300K in earnings is, you got to cut it by 100K at least, because you're gonna have to hire someone to replace, unless you're a mechanic yourself, which is great. So it just really depends. This one, I think, is, if you have direct industry experience, you could probably get this at a very reasonable acquisition price, and grow it quite substantially, especially if it's in a metro area there. So it's definitely an opportunity, but it has to be the right fit, in my opinion. This one's definitely more risky than the first one. Wonderful. Well, I think definitely want to go over a little bit about the advisory team. Who's on your advisory team? Everyone's going to kind of look at it differently, but a lot of times, folks are working with business coaches or lenders or a banker, an attorney. You might have an accountant, CPA, you might have investors. But regardless, we definitely encourage folks to put together that team to put together that acquisition plan, to hit that acquisition timer, and make sure that it goes as smoothly as possible. Definitely lean on folks that have been in the M&A business. I think utilizing internal folks within your family and network is always great, but just be careful with their expertise. One of the most common things we see, especially with attorneys, is that folks say, "Oh, I have an attorney friend or an attorney family member," and they don't work in M&A, and that generally does not go particularly well. So I would definitely recommend making sure that if you are, receiving counsel, to obtain it from folks that are doing this day to day, and therefore will provide a lot more direct insight and value, and just create a smoother process, and also protect you and de-risk you from any issues that may run from that point forward. So with that being said, here's just a quick list of some folks that you might want on your advisory team. It's definitely going to depend on how big your acquisition is and how detailed you want to get, and how much you have in terms of funds, and how detailed you want to put together that plan with. So it's definitely a very wide range, is what I'm trying to say. And so, what's best for you? With that being said, I think if there's any final questions, happy to answer those. We have our emails here at the bottom. If you have any additional questions, we'll certainly be reaching out in case we can answer any specific questions. If you're working with someone currently, then great. In terms of support roles, we view ourselves as a complementary service. So regardless of what you're looking to do, we know a lot of different folks in our networking groups. We talk with a lot of sellers, we talk with a lot of buyers, and definitely we're here to help. And so if there's any questions that are more specific or confidential in nature, we're definitely here to do so. And regardless, we'll reach out for feedback, and appreciate you being a part of this a little bit newer format, and where we actually go over listings and what have you. So with that being said, I don't know, Liz, if you have any other questions, or if anyone else does, but or
Looks
excuse me.
like Philip's itching to say something. He took
Oh,
himself
okay.
off. Yeah, he took himself the mic off.
Oh
So I
boy. All
figured,
right. All right.
yeah, that was my
Well,
cue.
yeah, no, I was thinking back on an experience that we had just last year with that attorney example, James. And so Marlon, Terry, so nice to have you guys on this morning. We really appreciate it. And we were working through a deal late last fall and into the winter, and it was a great deal. It was right here in North Carolina. Terrific business, wonderful owner, and the owner had brought her cousin in as the attorney. Well, her cousin was an HR attorney out of Ohio, and boy, oh boy, did she insist on using her. And despite our our best attempts to try to point her in a different direction, she was helpful. She put a lot of time in, but boy, oh boy, was she out of her depth, and it really drug things out a lot longer, and it added some additional sensitivities. And so I just think back on how much smoother the process could have been, and we got it over the finish line, and everybody was better for it, and it was ultimately a big win for everybody. But it was it was just so unnecessarily convoluted and complex, because of some of these allegiances and allies. And we realize that people want to have value, and there are some friends and family that are excellent advisors, but sometimes you've got to really proceed with a little bit more delicacy. And I think that's where you can turn to, whether it's ourselves or another local advisor, to kind of plug you into the right parties that are ultimately going to get this over the finish line. You'd hate to lose something, or have something fall out on you simply because you were trying to, maintain appearances, or throw somebody a bone per se. So I think that was a really good lesson that you imparted there, James. So I had to speak up and share share a little firsthand experience on that one.
No, definitely appreciate it. And I think I'm not sure if you commented on this, but the expense side, additional time and conflict, it's going to drive up costs, for everyone. And so that's the other, uh, I guess, byproduct, so to speak, of that situation as well.
Well
So
said.
uh,
Yeah.
I, I love it when we're efficient about time and money, and the transition plan. So that certainly wasn't the case in that situation, and hopefully we can prevent in the future. But you know, everyone has a different opinion and different way of approaching things. So regardless, we were there to support them, and we made it happen. So I'm thankful
Yeah.
for that, and certainly I look forward to any other challenges that we may come across moving forward. So.
Which we will.
Yeah, appreciate the
Terry,
comment there,
yeah.
Terry. So thank you for that in the chat box. And yeah, welcome to the M&A world. You're probably going to get hit with a lot of different angles and whatnot. My advice is kind of looking at it piecemeal. Actually, I think I might have a slide here for that. The next one. Yeah, I do. Here we go. One limb at a time. Just imagine you're climbing a tree. Just go one limb at a time. And if you're afraid of heights like me, just don't look down. You'll eventually reach the top. And just take it one step at a time, one limb at a time. And I think you'll be better for it. And we'll be happy with the results there. So that being said, thank you everyone for joining. And we're happy to discuss anything offline.
Yeah.
Yeah,
absolutely.
and thanks. And any feedback, like we said, this is really the first time we tried this. We just saw that a lot of buyers were coming to us with different questions and feeling like there wasn't that huge support system. So really, we're just looking to be a resource. So please give us feedback. You know, we are looking to continuously do these, you know, at least once a month to, again, just answer any questions. It might be this format. It might be truly, if we can get a lot of people just to input different questions, we can just sit there and have it more be an interactive session as well. So we appreciate you spending the first part of your morning with us. And we will send a follow-up email after this.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.
Great. Thanks, guys.
Thanks.